King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BC. The kingdom that Saul had begun, David had grown, and Solomon had made glorious, was over. Its capital city, Jerusalem, lay in ruins. Its people were dead, captive, or left destitute. I read from John Bright's book, The Kingdom of God in Bible and Church. The exile was a calamity of total proportions for the little nation, and its effect on Jewish life is not to be minimized. The land was a shambles. Practically every fortified town, including Jerusalem with its temple, had been destroyed by the Babylonians and left in ruins. Most of them were not rebuilt for many years to come. And while the actual number deported was not large, these represented the cream of the country's leadership. In addition, we may be sure that thousands had been slain in battle or had died of the rigors of the siege, while other thousands had fled for their lives. Only the poorest of the peasantry, considered incapable of stirring up trouble, were left to harvest the crops. Judah was a land drained of its inhabitants. Hi, my name is John Sluter. Welcome to the 12th episode of a series on King Saul of ancient Israel. In this one, we're going to continue talking about chapter 15, the mystery surrounding a loving God who nevertheless commands King Saul through the prophet Shemuel to kill the Amalekites, kill all of the Amalekites, kill the men, the women, and the children. It's appropriate that we started with a brief description of the fall of Jerusalem that takes place in 587 BC, because not only is this the key to understanding what's going on between God and Saul and the Amalekites, it also leads to what I consider the most close parallel to that episode in the Hebrew Bible. There are many. The idea of God wiping out an entire people, or indeed almost an entire species, is not a one-off thing. Other such incidences include, for example, I think most people are familiar with the story of Noah, in which the entire human species was wiped out. Only Noah and his family and the animals he carried with him on the ark were spared. The other prominent example that most people are familiar with is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, in which only Lot and his two daughters and, for a time, his wife were spared. Both of those are stories from Genesis. Probably less well known is Korah's rebellion, where a man named Korah and his family and his followers rebelled against Moses in the desert. His followers were consumed by fire. He and his immediate family, the ground opened up underneath their tents and swallowed them. Presumably they were taken alive down into Sheol. His sons, however, were spared. This idea of Khareb, that is, the destruction of an entire people, is not one that crops up only occasionally. It is pervasive in the entire story of the conquest of the promised land, because in Deuteronomy, the Lord tells Moses that when the Israelites enter into the promised land, they must destroy all of its peoples. But it doesn't turn out that way. And this is apparent from even the first conquest. The first conquest is Jericho. The Israelites famously circle the city on 7 consecutive days. On the first 6 days, they circle the city once, and they blow the ram's horn, the shofar. But on the 7th day, they circle the city 7 times, blow the shofar, and then the people of Israel shout in unison, and the walls of Jericho come tumbling down, and the people of Jericho are slaughtered, except for the family of Rahab. Rahab is a woman, a prostitute, who takes in the spies that the Israelites send to scout out the city. And she protects them. And she rescues them when people of Jericho search for them. She helps them escape, and they report back to the other Israelites what they have discovered. When Jericho is destroyed, she and her family are saved, are protected, and they continue to dwell and live among the Israelites and intermarry with them. In each of these stories, there's a strong theme of God punishing the guilty, punishing wrongdoers, and sparing the innocent, people like Moses, people who weren't involved in Korah's rebellion, and Lot and his family. Now, is the story of Rahab an exception to this? She, after all, was a prostitute, not a highly regarded profession at that time. I don't think it is an exception, because although she was a woman of lowly status, of a sinful occupation, nevertheless, the reason that she helped the spies from the Israelites escape, the reason she helped them was that she believed that the Lord had given this land over to the Israelites. And although it was a very self-interested thing to do for that reason, you could say that she believed the Lord, and it was reckoned to her as righteousness. By way of contrast, the people of Jericho did not fear God. They tried to apprehend the spies from the Israelites in order to kill them. Now, at this time, I want to raise what might for some be a freighted issue, and that issue is that it may be that the slaughter that is described in 1 Samuel chapter 15 didn't happen quite that way. It might not be that the Israelites went in and engaged in a wholesale slaughter of men, women, and children. There is evidence from other parts of the Bible that the violence of the ancient Israelites is sometimes exaggerated. Robert Alter, in his introduction to his translation, the book of Yeshua, says that the archaeological evidence does not support and tends to refute the idea that the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, principally because in the era in which this is supposed to have happened, Jericho was an unwalled village. Also, one would not expect the Amalekites to appear later on in Scripture if they in fact suffered utter destruction in 1 Samuel, but they do. A remnant of Amalekites is described in 1 Chronicles and in 2 Shemuel. An Amalekite rushes to King David and says that he found King Saul on a hill in the throes of death, and out of pity he killed him for his trouble. The Amalekite suffers his own extinction. Does that mean, then, that 1 Shemuel is false? It's a lie. I don't think so. If a part of Scripture is not the kind of truth that the reader is looking for, it is the reader's duty to determine what kind of a truth it is. Every writer makes a contract with the reader. If the writer projects an aura of journalistic accuracy and then lies, well, that's despicable. But that's not what the writer of 1 Shemuel did. He communicated that he's blending traditions, and he puts those traditions sometimes side by side. We have seen that when we compared chapter 13 and 14 to chapter 15 about the exact way in which Saul fell afoul of God and of Shemuel. Given the writer's transparency about this, it cannot be said that he's being false or deceptive if he casts facts or blends a tradition that he personally cannot vouch for. Then we have to ask, what truth is he telling? Now, it may be that the extirpation of the Amalekites was entire, but it may also be that it is meant as a metaphorical and as a virtual truth. I'm going to discuss what I mean by virtual truth toward the end of the video. Let me discuss the symbolic or the metaphorical implications of the entire destruction of the Amalekites now. As we have seen, the Amalekites committed their offense against God and against the Israelites when they attacked the Israelites in 1 century when they were vulnerable, when they were in flight from Egypt in the desert, in a land that they were strangers, without great resources except the help of God. And they were destroyed in another century, some 300-400 years later. We've also seen in the story described in 1 Shemuel that when the Israelites demanded a king, God was angry, and he exhibited his anger through Shemuel and by his own sovereign power by bringing a storm with lightning and thunder that terrified the Israelites so that they could know how offended God was that they chose a king over having a more direct relationship with God and letting God raise up a leader as needed on a, as it were, ad hoc basis. And then, when the people demand that and offend God and anger God, God gives it to them. But what God gives, he also takes away several centuries later. Several centuries and 2 dynasties. We see in chapter 15 of 1 Shemuel that Saul has not obeyed the Lord's commandment to utterly destroy the Amalekites, all of the men, the women, and the children, and indeed all of the creatures of the Amalekites, because he has preserved sheep and he has preserved cattle, and most important, he has not slain the king of the Amalekites. He has kept him alive. And God tells Shemuel that Saul is disobeyed and God regrets having made Saul king. Shemuel seeks out Saul and finds him in Carmel, where he is building a monument to himself. Now, as Shemuel approaches Saul, he hears the sound of sheep and cattle, much like Moses heard the sound of celebration before he came down to the plain and saw that Aaron had made a golden calf and the people were running amok. So he confronts Saul. Saul gives a lame excuse. Shemuel tells him that God has decided to eject him from the monarchy. Doesn't happen right away, of course, but that seems to be part of the idea that is expressed in 1 Shemuel chapter 15. Justice comes, but just not necessarily right away. Saul urges Shemuel to come back. Shemuel turns to go. Saul grabs his garment, it rips in his hands, and Shemuel instantly turns it into a metaphor for God ripping the kingdom away from Saul. Saul again prevails upon Shemuel to go back. Maybe he had reason to regret it based upon what happens next, because Shemuel agrees, and he asks for the king of the Amalekites to be brought to him. Then he takes a sword and cuts the king down as if he were a goat or a bull of a sacrifice. It is a metaphor. It is a metaphor for the destruction not only of Saul's dynasty, but eventually of the destruction of the monarchy of Israel and Judah. In 1 Shemuel chapter 15, Shemuel himself with his own hands undertakes to slaughter King Agag. It is a peculiar picture. One does not expect saintly persons, prophets, priests to undertake such dirty work themselves, but that's what Shemuel did. The image of Shemuel carving up King Agag is less strange when one takes it not as a literal event, but rather as symbolic of a priest or a prophet's traditional role, that of extirpating sin in a person, in a society, and in the world. And we can use what Shemuel did to King Agag as a microcosm of what God did through the Israelites by utterly destroying the Amalekites. If the Amalekites represent sin, then the slaughter of the Amalekites in their entirety represents the extirpation of sin. And when seen in this sense, even the long delay between the original offense of the Amalekites against the Israelites in the book of Exodus and their ultimate destruction in the book of 1 Shemuel serves the metaphor. To eliminate sin from the soul is the work of a lifetime, and even at the end of a lifetime, sin will in some form still persist. And the metaphor also serves to glorify the patience of God, because He knows that about us. I've been speaking so far as if the destruction of the Amalekites was entirely metaphorical. But could we suppose that it is not merely a metaphor, but is also historical. And if it is historical, could a reason be found that would explain why it had to happen? I suppose there are two potential explanations. The first one probably more solid than the second. And the first explanation is that God is God. God knows things, God can do things, God can command things that mere mortals cannot, that were mere mortals to command them according to their own light. It would be a crime. It would be a war crime. That's a sufficient answer, and probably any answer apart from that or that goes beyond that is speculative and less adequate. You can speculate that perhaps at the time of Exodus, the Lord foresaw several centuries later that by the time the Amalekites were completely extirpated, they would have absorbed so much demonic influence that there was no gap between the will of God's living enemy and their own will and their own practices. Let me say that I am not saying that the Amalekites deserved what happened to them. They might be victims too. It might be, as it were, something of a mercy killing, lest their depravity be perpetuated among future Amalekite generations and spread among the generations of the earth itself, and indeed among the generations of the Israelites. By doing what he did, by preserving the king of Amalek alive, Saul effectively transferred the curse upon Amalek, upon himself and upon his dynasty, and indeed upon the monarchy itself. Finally, what about the animals? I suppose that by doing something as solemn and grave as the extirpation of an entire people, by preserving some of the material possessions, filching the animals as it were, Saul and the Israelites who encouraged him to do that cheapened what they did, made it less solemn, less grave, more opportunistic. And by doing so, they dishonored the God who sent them upon this solemn task. 1 Samuel chapter 15, the story of the destruction of the Amalekites and the fallout from the failure to entirely destroy them, also contains an element that puts it squarely in the other stories where there is indeed a remnant, even though the Amalekites were extirpated down to the last man and indeed down to the last creature. Because on their way to the ambush, the Israelites encountered Kenites who were in proximity to the Amalekites and told them, "Get out of here. You've shown kindness to us in the past. You will live, but these brutes shall not." 1 Samuel chapter 15 begins with Shemuel announcing that he is the one who God chose to anoint Saul as king, and it ends with Shemuel doing performance art, as it were, a ritual defenestration of Saul and his dynasty by the slaughter of the king whom Saul had chosen to preserve alive. And isn't it interesting that at the beginning of chapter 13, Saul offends Shemuel by not waiting for him and performing the priestly sacrifice before a battle. But here at the end of chapter 15, Shemuel does the kingly duty of slaughtering the enemy king. Saul and Shemuel divide, and this too is symbolic of the perpetual separation and usual antagonism between the priestly class and the kingly class. Make no mistake, the kings of Israel and Judah had their bespoken priests. But for as long as the kingdoms existed, there existed those who, apart from the royal court, were willing to confront the king, and there were a few heroes who, within that court, were willing to speak up. And if the monarchies were willing to hand curate their priests. In chapter 16 of 1 Shemuel, God, acting through Shemuel, selects the successor to King Saul and the dynasty that will succeed the dynasty of Saul. So, the first 15 chapters of 1 Shemuel see the birth of Shemuel and his rise to greatness as a judge of Israel, a military leader and a prophet and a priest. And it sees the people clamor for a king, and it sees a young man, Saul, plucked from obscurity and rise to greatness. Saul is depicted in these early chapters as everything from a hero to a bumbler. In chapter 15, we see how Saul mars a spectacular victory over Israel's ancient enemy. He mars it because he fails to follow the instructions that God has given him. He fails to follow those instructions in a substantial way. He fails to follow them for narcissistic reasons. The narcissism is evident in the building that he does of a monument to himself in Carmel in chapter 15, and that monument points to the narcissistic element in his preservation of the Amalekite king. He's a king, and he identifies with the enemy king. And that narcissistic identification is so strong that he cannot bring himself to follow God's instruction and to kill that king. We have discussed several levels of symbolism for the destruction of the Amalekites and the death of the Amalekite king. And we have also dealt with the difficult issue of Cherev, what today we call genocide. At the end of chapter 15 of 1 Shemuel, Shemuel and Saul divide, and never again while they both live do they see one another. 1 Shemuel chapter 16 is the beginning of the narration of David's story, the story of David's dynasty. It's also the beginning of the end of Saul's dynasty. It's a long slide to extinction on a hill, defeated by his enemies, having no other good option. Saul will take his own life. That also seems symbolic, because his end and the end of his dynasty certainly was based on choices that God made, but it is indisputable that his end and his dynasty's end also came about because of choices that Saul made. Now is the time to return to the idea of the virtual destruction of the Amalekites, and it's time to return to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 587 BC by the Babylonians. Among those who suffered the siege, who saw the destruction of their city, there was a remnant. Jerusalem in time was rebuilt. But it must have seemed to be the end of the world. When the story of the destruction of the Amalekites was put in final form, those who were doing so knew what it was like to be a conquered people, knew what it was like to be destroyed by a foreign power, knew what it was like to see their little ones picked up and dashed against rocks. So when it came time to describe the destruction of the Amalekites, the people who were doing that describing identified with the Amalekites, not in the narcissistic way that Saul identified with the king of the Amalekites, but empathetically. And they projected their feelings about what had happened to them onto the Amalekites. And they could not describe it, therefore, as a partial destruction. The only way to describe the depth of their feelings and the horror of that time was to talk of Cherev. People will say that the Hebrew Bible exalts violence. I'm not so sure.